Neolithic funerary landscape and its impact on the long term. The case study of the Lima River basin, northwest of Iberia. The construction of megalithic tombs was one of the oldest ways of transforming the environment. This transformation, which originated in the regional Middle Neolithic between the end of the 5th and the end of the 4th millennium before Christ, created real visual markers or artificial scenarios that would have a multiplicity of meanings beyond those related to death. The social and symbolic impact of these monuments in the space where they are located was so great that they lasted for several culturally distinct periods after their construction and use. We refer, at least, to the regional Chalcolithic and Bronze Age, from the 3rd millennium to the beginning of the 1st millennium before Christ. The aim of this presentation is to understand the impact of the Neolithic funerary landscapes on the long durée in the lower and middle course of the Lima River basin, work which has never been systematized regionally. This work is part of my PhD project named Recent Prehistoric Mortuary Landscapes of the Lima and Neva River Basins, northwestern Portugal, supervised by Ana Betancourt, co-author of this presentation. Methodologically, we use data from previous excavations campaigns carried out by various authors, some published in detail, others unpublished. Data from excavations carried out with a scope of this work, and unpublished data collected within the scope of this project. The lower and middle course of the Lima River basin is located in southern Galicia, Spain, and northern Portugal, namely in the Alto Minho region. It is one of the main hydrographic basins of the northern region of Portugal, although the smallest of the Portuguese international hydrographic basins. It is limited to the north by Âncora and Minho river basins, to the east by the Douro river basin, particularly by its effluent Tâmega, and to the south by the basins to the Cávado and Neva rivers. The Lima River starts in São Mamed mountain range in the province of Ourense, region of Galicia, at an altitude of about 950 meters and flows into the Atlantic Ocean in Viana do Castelo. Between the source and the mouth, it covers about 108 kilometers, being 67 kilometers in Portuguese territory. Upstream, it runs on gently sloping land, carved out of the plateau at an average height of 800 meters. In the intermediate course, it runs through sloping terrain with pronounced slopes characterized by a very steep valley. The last section, further downstream, has slightly accentuated slopes, and the river runs through an open valley. The geological substratum of the region is predominantly granite and schist, rich in tin and gold resource. The research on Neolithic funerary practice in this region begins during the 18th century, when the Prince Lourenço Duval explored two megalithic monuments where he found bowls filled with charcoal and earth. Until the end of the 70s of the 20th century, various archaeological surveys were carried out in Portugal by Felix Alves Pereira, which results in some reports with brief descriptions of megalithic monuments. In Galicia, Spain, explorations of megalithic monuments are known since the beginning to the middle of the 20th century, with the works of Lopes Cuevillas and fellows. However, the first archaeological investigation with scientific methodologies in Portugal took place only after the 80s, with the excavations of 6 megalithic monuments by different research. At the same time, in Spain, Eguileta Franco, as part of a PhD project, dug for megalithic monuments. Already in the 21st century, a megalithic monument was excavated in Portugal as a part of a recovery project. If the number of megalithic monuments excavated so far is not small, considering the dimension of the Lima River basin, their exhaustive monographic publications has been scarce, with the exception of those studied in the doctoral thesis of Eguileta Franco, entitled Lower Lima Galega in Recent Prehistory, Archaeology of a Landscape in Inland Galicia. Also of note is the PhD thesis of Goretti Souza, entitled The Tumulus and Megalithic Phenomenon of the Galician Portuguese region of Minho, where it was mapped and described the megalithic monuments of the northern margin of the Lima basin on Portuguese territory. An observation of the bibliography and recent surveys allows us to conclude that the megalithic monuments, in terms of their topographic location, occur in valley areas, on the coastal platform, as well as on altitude gates and plateaus. The valley areas and coastal platform seems to reveal a smaller number of constructions in comparison with the altitude areas. However, this may not be cultural, but only related to the fact that the valleys and the coastal platform have been strongly humanized over time, leading to the destruction of many monuments at lower elevations. What is significant is the fact that this indicates that Neolithic communities that lived in the optimum climatic period occupied a wide territory from 34 to more than 900 meters of altitude. In terms of their organization in space, the non-megalithic funerary monuments are distributed in two different ways, seeming to obey different criteria. Some are built in the same space, giving rise to sets or clusters of monuments in a circumscribed territory, as it is the case, for example, of several necropolises. We are thus facing mortuary landscapes of intensive occupation in the Neolithic, functioning as memorials of ancestors, but simultaneously as places of social aggregation and identity promotion. Other monuments appear isolated in the territory, usually located in places with good visibility, from where other monuments can be seen, also isolated in the phenomenon of spatial communication between similar constructions, which simultaneously seems to be defined territories of a social and symbolic experience, of economic exploration and indicative of path. A good example occurs in Serra do Corno do Bico, north of Portugal, between the mounts of Chá da Morisca and Antela da Cruz Vermelha. Passing through the mount of Chá das Crivas and 6 other mounts, a path of about 3.8 kilometers. Despite the scarcity of publications, it is obvious that there are different types of constructions, both in terms of chambers and the mounds that cover them. In terms of chambers, there are monuments without megalithic chambers, with cystoid chamber, with closed polygonal chamber, with polygonal chambers with vestibule, with a polygonal chamber with a short or medium differentiated corridor, with a chamber with undifferentiated corridor. This diversity occurs sometimes in the same clusters or necropolis. Almost all of the chambers were made of granite, apparently local, by microscopic analysis, although the Galician lower Limia, occasionally materials from the substratum have been used if it is not granite, as noted by Igaleta Franco. Only 3 monuments with remnants of decorations are known. The Mota Grande in Ourense, with engraving and painting motifs like wavy lines, zigzag lines, and circular shapes. The mountain of Serra das Motas, also in Ourense, with wavy motifs painted in red directly in the surface of the supports, according to Fernando Carrera. And the Lapa da Moura in Chá de Cabanos, Ponte da Barca, not yet studied in detail, but which, besides the remains of paintings, also presents carved wavy lines in same supports. In terms of the mount, there are monuments entirely made of sediments. This contrasts clearly with other monuments which had more silty soils and which needed superficial lithic armor and a peripheral ring to seal off the burial chamber and corridor. It is thus noted that a phenomenon of mounds with only sediments is more common in the lower course of the Lima basin in low altitude areas. This behavior may be related to the ease of obtaining clayey sediments that are easily found in fluvial terraces and outcrops of rock clayed by chemical weathering, such as the so-called Alvarense clays, found in the vicinity of the Mount of Vila Fria. Note that the Mount of Faljange was built on a fluvial terrace. It is not possible to understand if this formal differentiation corresponds to chronological cultural differences, results from the availability of different research, or if there is a multiplicity of architectural selections at the same time, because the chronotypological table of the regional megalithic phenomenon remains to be made. Given the almost non-existence of absolute dates, we have tentatively placed the appearance and development of this phenomenon between the end of the 5th and the end of the 4th millennium before Christ. The only C14 date for this base of the artificial mount taken from the Mount 2 of San Bieto is not very operational due to its standard deviation. Even so, its calibration using Oxcal 4.4 software places the origin of this mound in the 4th millennium before Christ, given the higher probabilities at the 1st and 2nd sigmas. In any case, each monument corresponds to a scenario that is different from the other, which follows a specific architectural project and indicates its own biography that will be important to study in the future, at least in some cases. In terms of funerary rights, the acidity of the soils and ancient violations did not preserve the collection of human remains, with the exception of a part of a calotte and a mandible found inside the mound of Chapet, whose chronology is unknown, but which may have been more recent, being in the mind the context of reuse of this monument. Thus, we do not know how the bodies were treated, although Higueleta Franco considers the hypothesis of an individual inhumation for the Mound 5 of Outeiro de Cavalada, due to its dimensions. It is known, however, that the burial were accompanied by objects in variable combinations as ceramic vessels, geometric microliths, straight basin, triangular or pedunculated arrowheads in flint, schist and quartz, blades of flint and quartz, ships of flint, quartzite and quartz, stone ashes, hand mills, rolled pebbles, quartz crystals, a decorated metamorphic rock disc, a subpentagonal idol with lateral notch, discoid necklace beads in schist represent the ornamental objects. According to Higueleta Franco, excavation of the Outeiro de Cavalada 5 monument also made it possible to find foundational deposits. This deposit was made in a pit opened on the mound at the base of the monument's stone armor on its southeastern side, but was sealed by the latter. Two vases were found there, one resting on part of the other. Inside the one on the top was found an arrowhead in quartz. There seems to be a difference in the number of artifacts offered between the highland and valley monuments, an aspect already highlighted by Eduardo Jorge Lopes da Silva, and that one of us considers cultural and resulting from different ways of life, more pastoral and with greater mobility in the highlands, and more agricultural and tending towards sedentarization in the lowlands. However, some regularity should be pointed out, which indicates the importance and perhaps properties attributed to certain materials in the confection of lithic artifacts, as is the case of flint. This occurs in the greyish and whitish reddish variants. This indicates contacts between Neolithic communities of this region with others more southern communities, probably from the central zone of Portugal, Cantanhede and Nazaré, where the most northern deposits of greyish and reddish flint occur respectively. Also of note is the decoration of one of the semi-spherical containers with a series of crescent-shaped punctures on the rim, symbolism which is very common in containers from megalithic contexts in the north and center-north of Portugal, reflecting a specific language of death. Neolithic funerary landscapes materialized through megalithic scenarios of great visual impact continue to be significant for the communities which subsequently inhabited the territory, at least during the Chalcolithic period, that is, during a large part of the 3rd millennium before Christ. Examples of these are the fragments of bell-beaker vessels found in the chambers of various megalithic monuments, from the most coastal to the most inland lands. The penga vessels found in tomb monuments, the archer's arrowhead exhumed from the mound of Chefet, and the supposed halberd in flint from Mount 6 of Museum, considered by Nuno Soares to be from this period. According to Igaleta Franco, the concave basin arrowhead from Mount 2 of San Bieto in Lobios, Ourense, should be part of this period and considered part of a Chalcolithic use. Although the Chalcolithic use are relatively frequent in the megalithic monuments of the study area, they always seem to occur with little intensity in each of the tombs. This may reveal that only a few people were buried there, possibly of high social status, given the rarity and prestige of most of the material found. This phenomenon seems to indicate a multiplicity of meanings. On one hand, the recognition of the importance of the megalithic landscapes by the Chalcolithic communities. On the other hand, their little expressiveness as funerary contexts during this period. In this way, the reuse of the monuments in the 3rd millennium before Christ may be considered more as a social and ideological appropriation of the world and perhaps of the properties of the ancestors in a new chronological and cultural period. During the Bronze Age, Neolithic mortuary landscapes continued to be frequent, either through the reuse of some monuments or through actions and depositions in the vicinity of some of these monuments. Examples are the reuse of megalithic monuments materialized by the depositions of truncated cone-shaped containers, horizontal edges, bases, a high-necked pot, and a thin carinated bowl. Also of note is the use of the spaces surrounding two megalithic funerary monuments, Chada Morisca and Chefé. In the first one, necropolis of flat graves was built, from which two horizontal edges vases were exhumed, among other structures in pits or bordered with a wall. These actions took place about 50 meters to the south of the Chada Morisca Mound, which seems to cover a chamber with a corridor in a repeated use of space. It should be pointed out that two of the flat graves were marked with granite monoliths, which contributes to conferring visibility to this area of the necropolis. In the second case, a rectangular cist of Anya, was built, in which a truncated cone-shaped vase was deposited. This was located near the Mount of Lordil de Cima, Chefé, also reused with a vase of this type. With the data available, the occupation of Neolithic mortuary landscapes seems to have been more intensive during the early and middle Bronze Age than the late Bronze Age, the period of dating of the carinated bowl of fine ware from the mound of Lordil Cima, Chefé, by parallels with ceramic forms found in settlements of this period in northwestern Portugal. The organic adherents of the high-necked pot from one of the Prado mounds have been dated by carbon-14 to between the 18th and the 16th century before Christ. This data also indicates a strong symbolic charge of the ancestral landscapes and to the need to reinforce and affirm their integration in the new ideological, political and social frameworks of the early Bronze Age, naturally adding new meanings to them. To be noted, despite the representation of funerary sites in the long period, the change in the funerary rites as the dimension of the flat graves and deceased indicate the practice of individual burials in comparison to the presumed collective successive Neolithic burials. The maintenance of these significant landscapes after the Bronze Age and through thousands of years, although more invisible in archaeological terms, will still have persisted and given rise to place names and legends attributed to many of these places through the folk memory that urgently needs to be inventoried and further studied. Thank you for your attention.